There is one sentence, written by Nostradamus in 1554, that quietly destroys the most famous prophecy of the 20th century. It sat in a French national archive for 400 years. If anyone in 1939 had read it, the entire Hitler reading would never have left the printing press. But they didn't. One woman in Berlin opened a different book instead, handed it to her husband, and turned a Latin river name into the dictator's hidden code. Here is the line. Century 2, Quatrain 24. Beasts ferocious with hunger will cross the rivers. The greater part of the battlefield will be against Hister. Into a cage of iron will the Great One be drawn when the child of Germany observes nothing. Read it once, and the chills are obvious. A battlefield, Hister, a great one, in an iron cage. The child of Germany. It almost reads like a newspaper headline from 1945. That is exactly why this verse hijacked the entire reputation of Nostradamus. For most of the last century, the reading was simple. Hister, people said, was just Hitler with the letters shuffled. A 16th century French seer encoded the name of a 20th century dictator, born near the Danube, in the German-speaking world, fitting almost too well. The story spread through pulp paperbacks, post-war magazines, late-night television specials. By the time the internet arrived, the link was treated as common knowledge. Hister equals Hitler. Case closed. Except the case was never closed, it was barely opened. Because Nostradamus did not leave us guessing. He wrote almanacs, he wrote letters, he footnoted his own vocabulary. And in those documents he told readers, plainly, what the word Hister referred to. Once you read what he actually wrote, the Hitler interpretation falls apart in about 3 sentences. To see how, you first have to step into his world, a 16th century apothecary's shop in southern France, lit by tallow candles, smelling of rose petals and plague vinegar. His real name was Michel de Nostradamus, born December 1503 in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, France, not a wizard, a physician. He trained in Avignon, then at the University of Montpellier, one of the great medical schools of Renaissance Europe. He spent his early career chasing outbreaks of plague across Provence, mixing rose petal pills and prescribing fresh air decades before anyone understood germs. That is the man we are dealing with. A working doctor with a sideline in astrology, not a hooded fortune teller staring into a crystal ball. He only turned to prophecy in middle age. Around 1550, after the death of his first wife and children to plague, he began publishing almanacs, yearly pamphlets of weather forecasts, harvest tips, and short verses. They sold wildly. In 1555, he gathered the verses into a single book called Les Prophéties. 942 4-line poems, organized into groups he called centuries. The book made him famous. Catherine de' Medici, the Queen of France, summoned him to court. From plague doctor to royal consultant in 5 years. Now look at how he wrote. The quatrains are not French exactly. They are a stew: Old French, Latin, Greek, Italian, Provençal, anagrams, deliberate misspellings, classical place names. Scholars call it macaronic multilingual on purpose. He scrambles syntax. He drops capital letters where you would not expect them. He writes a word like Hister and lets you assume whatever fits your century. That ambiguity is the engine. It is also the trap. Every generation projects its own crisis onto verses written for a different one. And here is the crucial detail almost nobody mentions. Alongside the famous prophecies, Nostradamus published an almanac every single year from 1550 until he died in 1566. Those almanacs are not coded. They are plain prose, weather, politics, place names. He uses the same vocabulary in both books, which means if you want to know what a strange word in a quatrain means, you can just go check what he meant by it in the almanac of the same period. The dictionary is sitting right next to the riddle. That is exactly what serious Nostradamus researchers have done for decades. Peter Le Mesurier, a British linguist who spent 30 years translating the prophecies from the original 1555 print, did this work systematically. His conclusion was blunt. Most modern interpretations, he wrote, are people shamelessly twisting half-understood words retrospectively to fit the proposed event. The Hister equals Hitler reading is his prime example. Le Mesurier's translations are now standard in academic studies of the text, and they point to a very different answer for what Hister actually is. Let's go back to the famous line in the original, Century 2, Quatrain 24. The French reads, La plus grande part du champ sera contre Hister, word by word. La plus grande part, the greater part. Du champ of the field, the battlefield. Sera contre will be against Hister. Notice what Nostradamus did not do. He did not write Hitler, Heitler, or Hissler. He wrote a real word, capitalized, the way he capitalizes every other geographic name in the same book. And the word Hister was not invented by him. Open any Latin atlas printed in the 16th century and you find it. Hister, genitive history, the Latin name for the lower Danube, the second longest river in Europe. The Greeks called it Ister. The Romans used both. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, used Hister. By Nostradamus's day, every educated reader who could open his book would have recognized that word instantly, as a river, not as a future man. But it gets worse for the Hitler theory, because Hister is not the only river name in that quatrain's neighborhood. Just a few verses earlier, Nostradamus pairs it with another familiar name, Rhine, the Rhine. The two rivers, Rhine and Danube, were the textbook northern frontier of the Roman Empire. Every schoolboy in 16th century France learned them together. Reading Rhine as the Rhine River and Hister as the Danube is so obvious in context that the only way to miss it is to want to. Then there is the second Hister quatrain. Century 4, Quatrain 68. The Republic of Venice will be vexed by Hister. Try that one as Hitler. Venice vexed by a man who died in a Berlin bunker, having barely set foot in Italy except to meet Mussolini. Now try it as the Danube. Venice, a maritime city-state in the 16th century, was at constant war with Ottoman forces pushing up the Danube basin. That sentence is not prophecy. That is current events for 1555. And here is where it gets really interesting. Nostradamus did not leave the definition implied. He wrote it down, in black and white. Wait until you see the sentence he slipped into one of his own books, in plain prose, naming the river by both names in the same breath. If that one line had been better known in the 1940s, the entire Hitler reading would never have left the printing press. Yet for almost 400 years, almost no popular interpreter quoted it. Open his almanac of 1554. The book is online today, scanned from original copies in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Inside, in a passage called Prose Presage 222, he describes a vision of a scholar walking by a river. The line reads, in translation, a very scholarly man during this last quarter, while walking along the river Hister known as Danube, the ground subsiding, in the said river shall be lost. Read it again. The river Hister, known as Danube. He literally tells you. One sentence, written by Nostradamus himself, 11 years before the famous quatrain was widely read. He defines Hister as the Danube, in his own voice, in a book he sold under his own name. Not a translator's guess, not a modern skeptic's debunk. The author. There is no ambiguity left. If the man who wrote the word says it means a river, then it means a river. Everything built on top of the Hitler reading the books, the documentaries, the dramatic narrators, is built on ignoring that single line. Now the geography clicks into place. The lower Danube in 1555 was not a quiet European river. It was the front line. Ottoman armies under Suleiman the Magnificent were pushing up the Danube Valley year after year. Vienna had been besieged in 1529. Hungary was being torn apart. Naval battles raged in the Adriatic. For a French astrologer writing about the great battlefields of his own near future, The greater part of the battlefield will be against Hister is not mystical. It is a weather report on the Ottoman Habsburg War. Even the beasts ferocious with hunger crossing the rivers fits. 16th century writers routinely described raiding cavalry, Tartars, Ottomans, mercenaries as wild beasts crossing the Danube and Sava. The cage of iron was a common phrase for a fortress siege. The child of Germany that observes nothing is, most plausibly, a young Habsburg heir failing to react. Every phrase has a 16th century reading. The 20th century reading required throwing all of that out. So how did the throwing out happen? It started, of all places, in a German living room. November 1939. Berlin. Magda Goebbels, wife of Joseph Goebbels, was browsing a recent German book titled Mysterien von Sonne und Seele, Mysteries of the Sun and Soul. Inside was an essay claiming Nostradamus had predicted the year 1939 as a moment of crisis for England and Poland. She read it, marked the page, and brought it to her husband, Joseph Goebbels, was Hitlers Propagandaminister. He read prophecy the way a chemist reads a reagent, not as truth, as leverage. Within weeks, his ministry produced glossy brochures, translated into multiple languages, sent into neutral countries like Sweden, Switzerland, and the United States. The message: a 16th century French prophet had foreseen German victory. The Allies hit back fast. British intelligence printed counter leaflets, same prophet, opposite reading, airdropped over German territory. MGM in Hollywood produced a series of short Nostradamus films starting in 1940. Suddenly, the word Hister was everywhere, in every magazine, on every newsreel, always attached, with a knowing wink, to one specific name. Now you can see what that decision was. Magda Goebbels opening one book in 1939, then handing it to her husband. That single moment turned a Latin river name, used by Pliny, used by every Renaissance cartographer, used by Nostradamus himself in plain prose, into the most famous prediction in history. The river never went away. The maps still call it the Danube. The almanac still defines the word. Only the audience changed. So here's the question I want you to answer in the comments. If a prophecy only works after a propaganda ministry tells you how to read it, is it really a prophecy at all? Thanks for sticking through to the end. Your support means the world. Like, share, subscribe, 3 quick taps.